The vogue word for what newspapers produce and invest is public goods. All star again, public goods are notoriously underproduced in the marketplace, and news is a public good. And yet, since the mid-19th century, newspapers have produced news in abundance at a cheap price to readers and without need of direct subsidy. So the question that everybody is, I think, beginning to grapple with is if the marketplace in this country can't provide these public goods, what form of funding could be considered in order to provide them. We live in a country that I think is incredibly fortunate to have public service broadcasting, and I think some people are now questioning this idea of public service reporting, complement the idea of public service broadcasting. Now, I know some people shrink from any kind of public subsidy, and amongst those are most local newspapers. In fact, they recoil from it. It is a given that newspapers don't take public subsidy, they don't want to be regulated, they want to be free and independent. And there are some people who just have an ideological objection and think that newspapers are no more deserving public subsidy than other kinds of trading industries. When I first raised this subject about 9 months ago, I was not overwhelmed by a rush of enthusiasm of people who wanted to embrace this idea. And that's fine, but I think we must face up to the fact that if there is no public subsidy for some form of public service reporting, then the world as described by Paul Starr will come to pass in this country. And if newspapers can't or won't do this kind of reporting, not because they don't want to, but because they can't afford to, or they won't take any subsidy to do so, then we have to ask what other mechanisms there are for doing that and for paying. I think this is a much larger question than simply about journalism. I think it's a big question for society itself. And I sense, as the wolf gets nearer the door, all kinds of people who dismissed the idea originally are beginning to wonder. There have been interesting suggestions from Ofcom and from Lord Carter's Digital Review, looking at what might happen if ITV does indeed pack its bags on local news and get out of it. There is a very interesting idea of contestable funding by which local news organisations could get together and form consortia. Could form consortia essentially to provide an alternative to the BBC monopoly of broadcasting. I think local newspapers again were cool on that idea initially. But I suspect if that idea were able to catch fire and advance, and local newspapers saw, for instance, independent producers saying, well, actually, we wouldn't mind doing that, I think local newspapers might change their tune in terms of getting together to do that kind of reporting. But you then wonder who else could do that kind of service, the basic public service reporting, a fundamental service of reporting on courts and public authorities, not Hansard style, not verbatim, not they work for you, but bringing reporting some of those qualities that I described earlier from conventional media, made available for everybody. I'll start with a complete non-starter, which the BBC could do. And the advantage of the BBC doing it is that it already has the public money. The money is there, and it would be just a question of the BBC deciding how to allocate it. So, for instance, it costs, I think, about 90 million quid to run BBC 3. And BBC 3 is an interesting thing. It's an incubator of our talent, and then the BBC likes it because of the demographic that it attracts. But I think there is a big question about as to whether that money wouldn't be better spent on this fundamental vital task of public service reporting than the kind of thing that BBC 3 produces. Now, the advantage of that would be that it would be an easy question to reallocate BBC resources, and it doesn't get to the questions of top slicing and giving to anybody else. I said that was a non-starter because I think that people just don't like the idea of the BBC getting all that money. It arises all the fears of monopolism, and you saw all the anxieties when the BBC announced that they were going to do something like that in terms of getting into local news. But I think there's another nascent idea, which is the Press Association, which is a public service organisation And I know the domestic, I know that Tony Watson and Paul Potts from the Press Edition are working on an idea at the moment, which they've just been developing. And their idea is something like this, that in return for subsidy, the Press Association would contract to publish straight news reporting of designated public authorities and courts. That material would be usable and shared by anyone who wanted to use it, and the PA could themselves subcontract much of that reporting to local newspapers on two conditions. One, that it met due standards of accuracy, balance, and fairness, and secondly, that it could be distributed by and shared by everybody. I think that this is how the New Zealand Press Association works. The audience knows about New Zealand. It's the sort of opposite of the PA model where the PA distributes content which is then used by the local newspapers. All the local newspapers feed into the New Zealand PA. If I'm wrong about New Zealand, that's the idea that I'm trying to describe. So newspapers would have to go over this barrier that they just reported to their own communities. They would have to share this money. Newspapers would be entirely free to challenge, campaign, criticise, comment, and abuse the politicians that they were writing about. But there would be a factual bedrock on which to build. It's the absolute division between fact and comment that C.B. Scott wrote about in 1921. The PA is now seeking actively to trial this and is looking for funding. So if anybody being rich in the audience, I urge you to think about this, because I think that the advantage of PA doing it is that it takes away the monopoly idea of the BBC. I think the PA is a tremendously respected organisation, and there's no reason why they couldn't do it in partnership with the BBC and lots of local newspapers. I think the need is there, and I question as to whether the will or the sense of urgency is there, but I think it's going to be needed pretty quickly. I just want to end with, as I was driving here, I was remembering coming here last, the British Association to a dinner that was held in the wake of the Huffman report into BBC's reporting of Andrew Gilligan. And it was the most distinguished dinner I've ever been to. Tremendously grand people that were there. All the institutions of state were gathered. No idea why I was there. But there were peers, and there were cabinet ministers, and there were spooks, and there were soldiers, and there were judges, and all off records. I can't tell you who they were. But they were the sort of cream of British society. And in fact, Lord Hutton himself was there. And they were discussing the Hutton Report and Iraq and how important it ended up in Iraq. And one by one, we went round the table, and the spooks talked about their failure, and the cabinet ministers who were there talked about their failure, and the parliamentarians talked about the failure of Parliament, and the soldiers were tremendously proud of the military, and sort of the intelligence had failed. And out of that dinner emerged, I think, an unlikely hero in the form of Andrew Gilligan. And some of us know Andrew he's an unlikely journalistic hero. He wouldn't star in any film ever. He's shambling, he's a bit obsessive. His story wasn't 100% right in ways that could have stood up in court. But all these people there, and all the institutions of the state, if you think of the press as an institution, they all said actually the press was the only bit that actually did its job in that. Andrew Gilligan, for all his failings, got something into the bloodstream. He got something out into the debate that needed to be got out. And it was just interesting how he had done what a journalist should do, and the press had done its job in a strange way there. And that came not from the journalists, it came from all the other people who were sitting there, possibly Robert Hutton. So that was just my memory of last being at the VA. So I just want to thank the British Association